Ooh, as I mentioned, the lack of aero is gonna cause some oversteer problems in some of these higher speed corners. Hey everybody, welcome back to the second installment of how I prepare for a race. After learning the track and optimizing our line in the last video, today we will look at setting up the car. Car setup is a very extensive topic which can take hours and hours to explain. So for now, we will just focus on the basics and key setup changes that are needed to give us an advantage at Fuji. There's a lot to talk about, so let's get started. The first thing we need to do is we need to choose a starting point for our setup. This is a PCA League race, which means everyone will be driving the Porsche GT3R. We'll need to decide if we want to start with a setup that has high downforce, low downforce, or something in between. This is a 3-hour race, so we'll be using full fuel load for it. And most of the time is spent equally in low and mid-speed corners. We want a setup that prioritizes the car's performance in these corners that precede long stretches of full throttle. And since they are low-speed corners, we can't make use of the downforce, which hurts our straight line performance. So we're gonna start with the default low downforce endurance setup. From experience, I know this setup will severely oversteer in high-speed corners. With this information, my plan is to add only as much downforce that is needed to keep the car balanced during the high-speed sections, namely turn 4 and 5. So let's go test this setup. So here I am with the low downforce setup to test how it feels. And the biggest trouble we're gonna have is probably this corner. Probably gonna be tons of oversteer, and we're gonna have to manage our speed going through here. But, you know, a lot of these corners are kind of low speed with a lot of flat out sections. So a lot of that aero is really only gonna benefit those last two corners and kind of hurt us everywhere else. But whether it nets out to be a overall positive is something we're gonna have to experiment. So our delta's already coming down bit by bit. Wow, gaining a lot of time down the straight. Braking distances would be longer though. Ooh, as I mentioned, the lack of aero is gonna cause some oversteer problems in some of these higher speed corners, especially in the fourth gear. Ooh. And everywhere else, you can see how quickly that delta comes down. Watch this one. Feels like the brake bias is a bit too backwards. I'm gonna move it up 2 clicks. Okay, once again we can see, even though that last turn wasn't done too well, we can see the delta come down very, very quickly. A bit loose there, going over those curves. So a setup thing we need to think about. Move my brake bias forward a few clicks again. So it looks like we're gonna really have to move that aero balance backwards. But I think this lower aero trim is gonna net out to be faster. Okay, so we're slowly getting more and more used to this setup and getting quicker and quicker with it. I don't think we'll be able to beat our previous high downforce time without tweaking this setup, but I think after we tweak it, we should be able to be faster. We're gonna need some stability fix going through that last corner there. And also the key thing to think about is with lower downforce, it's gonna give you very easy passes down the straight. Because in the high speed sections, even if you have a lot of downforce and you're very, very quick, it's people aren't gonna be able to pass you there. So in a racing situation, it's not gonna be that much of an advantage. So let's finish this lap, take a look at our tire conditions, and make some tweaks. We can see definitely here our tire wear is very rear biased. So that explains a lot of the looseness we're seeing. Heat-wise, it's pretty close. So nonetheless, we need to fix that aero to begin with and then tweak it elsewhere as well. So let's take a look at the data and see what we find. Alright, so after a brief test with that low downforce setting, we've identified a few problems, and so we're going to try and fix it through setup, because it's not really something a driver can really do much about when the car's really out of balance. So the first thing we want to do is really figure out what we're setting up for, right? So if we look at Fuji Speedway, the longest straight is actually the front straight. And coming out of corner 16, we can see that it's about 22.7 seconds of full throttle. So we really need to set the car up properly for turn 16, which is a pretty low speed corner, which means the minimum speed for this corner, turn 16, is 90 kilometers per hour, right here. Next, we have turn 6, which following turn 6 is about 12 seconds of full throttle. And this is also a fairly low speed corner at 97 kilometers per hour of min speed. And both these corners are pretty long, right? So turn 16 is about a 202 degree turn, and turn 6 is a 124 degree turn, right? So we really need to set the car up for low speed corners, in particular long corners where the transitions are very, very gradual. What this tells me is we can set the car up reasonably soft and compliant as long as we're not running too much aero. Now, looking at the aero, we had tested the low downforce setting, which I think is the appropriate one, even having before looked at the data. So what we see here is that about 90+% of full throttle time actually comes out of a low speed corner. And very, very little time at full throttle do you get out of a mid-speed corner. So really another reason why you really want to prioritize low speed corners in your setup. Similar, when we look over here, the amount of time spent cornering in low speed and mid speed corners are pretty similar, and there's about maybe 20% of time is spent in high speed corners. But again, what's important is not so much the time that you spend in the corner. It's important, but not as important as what happens after the corner, which most of the time in full throttle is spent coming out of a low speed corner. So what we can see here is in the low speed corners, about 15 seconds of the time the car is under traction limit, meaning it doesn't have enough grip whilst under throttle. And about 7 seconds of the time it is in braking and not having enough grip. And about 5 seconds in these low speed corners is where the car has more than enough grip. And what this tells me is we really need to focus on getting more grip under throttle in low speed corners. So what this also tells me is that there is about 3 seconds of mild understeer during the traction limited throttle phase, and a tiny bit of mild oversteer. So that's going to be something we're going to have to keep in mind when we're adjusting the setup. Now, going over the mid-speed corners, the car is relatively neutral, and a lot of the time there's enough grip for the car. So traction limited time in throttle is only about 6 seconds, and traction limited time under braking is only about 5 seconds, which goes back to that we really have to focus on this low speed setup. Now, one of the big things we talked about earlier is the car has too much forward aero balance, meaning that we need to move the aero balance backwards, and the car's too oversteering at high speed. And we can see here during the high speed sections where, for example, as we go through turn 8 and 9, which isn't really important because we're flat out anyway, but you can kind of see that the aero balance is moving more and more and more forward to a peak of about, well, this is during braking, so I don't know if it counts, but even when we're flat, to a peak of about 40% of aero balance forward. And what we're really aiming for this car is about 34.1% of aero balance in the front. Now, these things are going to be different for every car depending on the weight distribution and how your mechanical grip is set up. But this is going to give us a ballpark. If we aim for 34, we can always start tweaking from there. Now, the area where we need to focus on is turn 3, 4, and 5, which is where the highest cornering speeds are for this track. Now, if we zoom in to turn 3, 4, and 5, we can see that the aero balance fluctuates as it normally would, particularly depending on whether we're on the brakes or on the throttle, so how pitched the car is. And more importantly, when we're going through corners 4 and 5, which is similar in speeds to turn 3, as you can see here, but it is much longer in duration. And we can see that the aero balance goes from low 30s to a peak of about 43.5, which is just far too high. It even reaches 45% forward aero balance here. So what we really need to do is find a way to bring this aero balance down maybe about 10%. So now how do we do this? Basically, we have two ways, right? We can adjust the wing or adjust the ride heights. What we're going to try and do is we're going to keep the wing as low as possible because we want to keep the drag as low as possible. So first, we're going to see how much ride height change we need to satisfy what we're looking for, which is a 10% decrease in front aero. So ultimately, because we want to keep the drag low, we're going to keep the ride height in the front as low as possible, which means we have to drop the rear ride height or decrease the rake in order to move the aero balance back. Now, one of the ways of how we can calculate how much ride height we need to drop is we can go to the Aero calculator. Not all cars are going to have this, but fortunately, this car does. So in iRacing, if we go to the garage, usually on the Tires and Aero page, there is an Aero balance calculator, right? So what we need to do is just enter our dynamic ride heights, so the ride height at the time of what we need to analyze. In this case, the front ride height is 32.6 millimeters. So what we do is we just set this to 32, well, we can't do 32.6, so we'll just do 33 at 0 wing, which is what we had the car set at. And we want an aero balance that is close to 34, maybe just slightly under, because this is really at the peak of it. So let's say we aim for 37%. So now we need to drop the ride height in the rear until we hit 37. So that tells me we need a rear ride height of 15 millimeters in that situation to get 37% front aero. Now going back to our data, if we look at what our rear ride height is, and we can see that here, our rear ride height is 44.1. So which means we're gonna have to drop the car around 30 millimeters. Now normally I would just drop it and test it out, but realistically I think that is a bit too low. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna increase the wing by 1 and drop it slightly less than that. Another thing that we need to think about is that this is a dynamic ride height, so it's really affected by aero in itself. So in other words, if we use a softer spring, the rear will compress more with the downforce that it has, meaning it will have a lower ride height at this time, even if we don't do anything. So I'm really going to use a combination of both. I'm going to soften the rear, and I'm also going to reduce the rear ride height. So if we go to here, and I'm just going to select let's say the softest spring that we have, 260. And keep in mind the ride height's gonna change. So right now we just make a record of it as 52.6. See, and it just updated and it's gonna change to 42. So we need to move it back to 56. Put Make sure you keep it symmetrical. Okay. So this is basically the same setup ride height we had before, but because the springs are softer, we know going through those corners that the rear ride height is going to be sitting lower, but probably not low enough, because what we really need is 30 millimeters lower than what it was before. And I know we're not going to get that just from the springs. So I'm going to lower it to as much as we can, which is just above 50. Now, if we hit apply, we need to change some of these numbers so that they pass tech inspection. Because we've softened the rear of the car a lot and lowered the rake a lot, what's going to happen is that the car is going to be a lot more understeery than before. Because of one, the softer rear, and two, the rearward aero balance. Now, that's what we want for high speed, but at low speed, that's not really what we want, because the car's already a little bit understeery. So to combat that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to soften the front ARBs, the anti-roll bars. Now, the question is, well, why don't I stiffen the rears? And the reason is because the rears are already at full stiff. So my only option is to soften the front. Another alternative is I can soften the front springs, but as we can check here, they're at the lowest setting already. Now, all that's left to do is just to save this as a test setup. So I'm gonna call it Fuji test. And just one quick glance over to see if everything is okay. We're probably gonna have to tweak this ride height later because the fuel load is about half fuel, and I think we're probably pretty close to the lower limits of the tech. Now, I've kept this setup changed pretty simple. All I've done is soften the rear, change the rear ride height, and soften the front ARBs. You don't want to do too much, and ideally, you only really want to change one thing at a time, but for the first pass, I kind of know what I'm looking for, and I have a pretty good idea that I'm moving all these things in the right direction, so, you know, I can do that. But if you're new to this, you want to make one change at a time. And I will get to a point where I can only make one change at a time, which is when I make very, very fine and minute adjustments. But for big changes that I need, changing a few things is okay. And one last thing, right now we're still at 0 wing. I might add a wing later on, depending on how the car is, but I'm gonna test it like it is right now. So all we gotta do is just get in the car and check it out. Okay, so we're back at Fuji, testing this new setup that we just put together. And one important thing is that you gotta make sure you set the weather identical to how you've always been testing it, because any small variance in weather could really throw your test and your results off because you don't know what's improving or not. So the outlap, just gonna get back used to my markers. I'm just getting a flow for the track. I haven't driven this track in a few days, so I don't drive much nowadays. So I can already feel there's a lot more stability in the car. The car feels like it takes quite a bit of effort to turn. So our goal for this test is we need to figure out if the aero balance is appropriate to go through turns 3, 4, and 5. And in the low speed corners, whether we've put in too much understeer into the car now. So those are the two main goals. And depending on what the outcomes are, we're gonna have to make further tweaks. Well, regardless, we're probably gonna have to make further tweaks, but those outcomes will tell us what kind of changes we need to make. Oh yeah, lots of understeer. Doesn't really want to turn in all that well.
You got that corner and got a slow down penalty.
Okay, so it took that curb on the left side. The car didn't like it too much. One reason could be that we only adjusted the rear spring rates and we didn't touch the dampers. But I didn't want to change too much. And to be honest, the dampers, we don't know what the damping rates are, so it's kind of hard for me to kind of set a good baseline whenever I change the spring rates. Very understeery still. Let's give it a few more laps. Let's see how it is after the tires are warm. So what we're looking for is, we know the low speed has become quite understeery. And ideally we would dial in a bit more oversteer, which we can, we still have the capacity to, but that really depends if the high speed is where we want it to. Because if the high speed section is not understeery and we put in more oversteer to the car, we're gonna have trouble in those sections. So to fix that, if it does still oversteer, we're gonna need to add more wing. Yep, still oversteering. So it's very possible that in spite of the lower spring rates in the rear, we still don't have the ride height in the back as low as we'd like it to be. And data is really going to tell us that. But just from my experience and my hunch, I'm pretty sure that's what's happening. So I think what we're probably going to need to do is add wing and soften the front anti-roll bar some more.
Just set your fastest lap of the session.
So we can actually try putting on throttle a bit earlier. There's so much stability now. Yeah, it's definitely that
You cut the cord,
curve.
gotta slow down and give up that time.
So we're gonna make some changes on the fly. What we're gonna do is add a tiny bit more wing, add 1 degree of wing. We are going to soften the high-speed compression and rebound on the back. So we're gonna click these wrong way. Maybe add 6 clicks to each. I'm adding so many because we made a pretty significant spring rate change. And also, I'm gonna drop the front anti-roll bar. Let's hit it to bottom and see how the car behaves now. So another trick we can use to tweak that balance of the car, especially in turn-in, is our brake bias. Especially since we can see that we're using so much wheel to get the car turned as we're going into the corner. So the car seems to behave a little bit better. Still a bit oversteery into those fast corners. Yeah, it's still a bit jittery just right after going over that curb. Woo! Okay, the car is still very loose. Let's give it another try. Let's see what happens. So quite a bit of exit stability there. Ooh.
You cut the cord, you've got to slow down and give up that time.
So lifting definitely creates a lot of oversteer at high speed because of the pitch change. Okay, so we're still having high speed problems, even though the low speed seems a lot better, actually pretty good. So let's give it another go. If this doesn't work, we're gonna have to keep adding wing to it. Yeah. Very hard to control. So, we're gonna have to tweak this a little bit and keep tweaking it. And let's see what happens. Okay, so reviewing the data, what I noticed that going through turns 4 and 5, when I lift on the throttle, the front end dips a lot, and that dramatically increases the rake, which pushes all the aero forward, and that's why it was getting really hard to control once I started trying to manage its speed. So, to combat that, I put in a bit more front stiffness and stiffen the front compression as well. So now you can see when I lift, the car has still a lot of stability. So let's see what happens when we kind of add more speed into it. Obviously the downside is now our front end's a lot stiffer, which is going to create a lot more understeer, especially in the lower speed sections. But we're just going to have to find a compromise. And the trouble is that we are out of adjustment for our anti-roll bars. Our front is on full soft and rear is on full stiff. And this is what, oh, you see this understeer right here. And this is what setting up a car is like. It's always just full of compromises. You can never really get it to do exactly what you want because something's always out of range. Lots of understeer. Okay, so when I lift at speed, it still does rotate quite a bit, but it's a lot more predictable and manageable. But when I'm on the throttle, though, lots of understeer. Oof, so much understeer. Couldn't get the car turned in, but let's see how the car is in neutral throttle. Because if I can avoid lifting and keeping the car neutral, it should be... Oh, so it's still pretty good. High speed is pretty good. But rear tires are overheating. We can see that on the tire pressure gauges that's on the car. Okay, very controllable once you minimize the input changes, especially on the throttle. Okay, so this looks like a decent lap. So I'm going to try one more to see if I can pick out anything that I really want fixed. Maybe the ability to handle that curb could be better. So there's a lot of oversteer going into that corner. Have to check out why that's doing that. Still a lot of this understeer in the low speed corners is costing me a fair bit of time. An exit oversteer on throttle. Could be the diff. Okay, so now I've checked that out and looked at a couple of things and identified where improvements can be made. We're going to go back to the data, go back to the drawing board, figure out what we need to work on next. After studying the data, I've made some tweaks and then some more tweaks, including brake bias, anti-roll bars, and a number of other settings. In a moment, I'm going to show you what a lap with this setup looks like. But we are not done. At this point, the setup is just good enough to share with my teammates to get their opinions and see what other changes we need to make sure that everybody is fast and can drive the car confidently. We will also need to start taking things like tire wear into consideration. From here, we need to finalize the race setup and then work on the quali setup. All of this is not too different than what you just saw me do, but with different conditions and requirements in place. After the setups are done, we will begin working on our strategy, which may require further changes to the setup. Before I show you the lap, I have lots more other videos on how to go fast, so check them out. And if you have any questions or would like to learn more about how I can help you go faster, check out my website at www.last10th.com or find me on Discord by going to discord.last10th.com. In the meantime, keep sending it and I'll see you next time.